In the summer of 1521, the air above Belgrade was thick with the sound of thunder not from the sky, but from the bronze mouths of Ottoman cannons. For 40 days they spoke without pause. Each roar rolled across the Danube, shaking the walls, shaking the hearts of those who still prayed inside them. Smoke rose from the bastions like breath from a dying beast, and the city that had once stood as a Christian bulwark against the east began to crack. The chronicles say the sky itself turned black with ash and fear. The smell of saltpeter, burning flesh and wet stone fused into one, carried by the wind through the ruins of churches and homes. Bells rang not for mass, but for warning each peal a countdown to collapse. Women clutched their children, men scrambled to fill breaches with their own bodies, and above them fluttered banners already burned by fire. At dawn on August 29th, the Ottoman janissaries advanced through the smoke. The walls of Belgrade, once thought impregnable, had become open wounds. Behind them marched not chaos, but precision ranks of soldiers hardened by decades of conquest, led by the man whose name would come to terrify half of Europe's Sultan Suleiman, soon to be called the Magnificent. The conquest of Belgrade was not a sudden storm. It was a rehearsal for empire. The Ottomans understood that victory was not measured only in cities taken, but in bodies acquired, in souls subdued. As the defenders were cut down, the rest of the population was sorted, not randomly, not brutally in the common sense, but according to rules older than the cannons themselves. Men to chains or execution, boys to conscription, and women the true currency of empire to a fate that would outlast the rubble. Contemporary accounts describe the aftermath not as looting but as inventory. Ottoman officials moved through the broken streets carrying ledgers instead of swords. Each surviving woman was registered, inspected and assigned. Their names, Serbian, Hungarian or Wallachian, were written once, then crossed out, replaced by numbers, traits and eventual prices. To the conquerors this was not barbarity. It was administration. Every conquest required an order, a ritual, a logic that could make horror feel like governance. The empire's jurists had already codified it, the concept of sabaya, the lawful taking of women in war, sanctioned by scripture, perfected by bureaucracy. Behind every banner of faith stood a merchant's hand. As night fell over the captured city, the fires of Belgrade cast a red glow upon the river. The screams had quieted, replaced by the low chant of prayer from the Ottoman camps and the rattle of chains. In the Sultan's tent, secretaries recorded tallies, prisoners taken treasures, catalogued routes prepared for transport to Constantinople. Even the ashes were accounted for. Outside, a small procession of captured women was led toward the docks. Their faces were blank, their steps automatic, as if the soul had retreated somewhere too deep to be reached. Some had lost children in the chaos, others husbands. None yet understood that they had entered a machine far larger than war, one that turned human life into wealth, devotion into domination. The fall of Belgrade was celebrated across the empire as divine favour. Sermons praised the Sultan as the sword of Islam, the restorer of order. But in the silence between verses another truth lingered, one that no chronicler dared write. Every empire needs a language to make cruelty sound sacred. Belgrade became more than a conquest. It became a model. From its ruins, the Ottoman administration refined a system so efficient that future campaigns in Rhodes and Buda in Cyprus would replicate it almost exactly. Each city fell not just to cannon fire, but to calculation. The looting was brief, the record-keeping eternal. Faith wrapped itself around cruelty like gold leaf around iron. Clerics blessed the soldiers while accountants tallied the spoils. Even in triumph, the empire behaved like a clerk collecting, sorting and filing. The conquest was only the opening chapter. The real work began afterward in silence with ink and seal. If one could have stood at the edge of the city that night, watching the torches of the departing caravans disappear into the dark, it might have seemed that the war was over. But for the women being carried away, veiled, branded, nameless, it was only beginning. They were the raw material of an institution that would outlive sultans and generals, a network of markets, palaces and prisons built on their bodies. Their suffering would become an industry, their despair a currency. What began at Belgrade would echo for centuries until even history itself forgot their names and remembered only the empire that bought them. And so as the Danube carried the reflection of a burning city into the black horizon, the foundations of something far colder were being laid, an empire, not only of territory but of human property managed with the precision of law and the indifference of habit. The siege had ended, the system had begun. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from glory as the Empire understood it was never free? Each victory had an invoice written not in ink but in flesh. The thunder of cannons, the gleam of silk banners, the architecture of conquest, all were paid for by the bodies of the conquered. When the Ottoman treasury opened its ledgers after Belgrade, the figures spoke a truth the poets never did. War was an investment, and its dividends were human. A long campaign drained resources faster than faith could replenish them. Every cannonball cast at Belgrade cost a handful of silver coins. Every galleon launched down the Danube demanded oak iron rope and men to row it. Even piety came with an expense soldiers needed, wages horses needed. Eid and the Sultan's court required gold-threaded triumphs to justify the blood it shed. Where did the money come from? It came from people. The enslaved were not just byproducts of war. They were the fuel that kept the imperial machine turning. One captured girl could sell for 10 silver marks, a skilled artisan for 40. The numbers multiplied quickly, hundreds taken from one fortress, thousands from a campaign. By the time the captives reached the markets of Bursa or Constantinople, they had already been converted into capital commodities, moved along a chain of profit that reached from battlefield to palace. Merchants followed armies like vultures following battlefields. They brought wagons, coins and parchment ready to purchase the defeated before the bodies were even buried. It was said that in the Ottoman frontier towns, the first sound after cannon fire was the clicking of abacuses. Historians sometimes describe this system as organized barbarity, but that phrase misses the deeper truth. It was civilization turned inward, using its intelligence not to build schools or temples, but to quantify despair. The empire had inherited the wisdom of older markets, Venice, with its auctions on the Adriatic docks, Cairo, with its chained corridors of Nubian and Circassian slaves, Crimea, with its bustling human fairs in Kaffa and Tana. The Ottomans did not invent the trade, they perfected its paperwork. In the Venetian Republic, the traffic in human life was disguised under contracts and maritime law. A Christian merchant could purchase a servant in the East, baptize them and resell them in the West for double the price. The language softened the crime, but the arithmetic was the same. The Ottomans watched learned and replaced baptism with conversion contracts with a Quranic legitimacy. Both systems sold the same illusion legality as morality. In Cairo, under the Mamluk sultans, markets were arranged like bazaars of obedience. Young boys were bought not for labour, but for loyalty, to be trained into soldiers who owed their souls to the ruler. When the Ottomans absorbed Egypt in 1517, they absorbed that model too, blending military slavery with household servitude. What had once been a spiritual transaction, the conversion of captives, became a financial instrument. By the mid-16th century, Ottoman conquest had stabilized into a rhythm of acquisition. A city fell, its population was processed. Roughly 1/5 of the captives were claimed directly by the Sultan as pensik, the royal fifth, while the rest were distributed among soldiers sold to merchants or taxed in kind. The treasury thus ensured that human life became a renewable resource of empire. To understand the Ottoman Golden Age, one must look not only at its domes and palaces, but at the ghost economy beneath them. The same silver that lined the Sultan's table had first passed through the trembling hands of a captive woman. The same coins that paid the architects of mosques had been minted from taxes on flesh. There was a cruel symmetry in it all. The empire built monuments of faith from the prophets of sin mosques that echoed with verses of mercy funded by the screams of the market. The paradox did not trouble the scholars of the court. They saw no contradiction between divine law and imperial necessity. They wrote legal treatises, explaining that to enslave was to bring infidels under God's order. It was salvation by subjugation, civilization through chains. And yet there were whispers even then among foreign observers, among defeated priests, among the women who survived, that this order had a stench no incense could mask. In one Venetian letter, a merchant confessed that Constantinople's great bazaar smelled of rose oil, sweat and despair. In another, a Franciscan friar wrote that the commerce of souls is the true gold of the Turk. The Ottoman state had found a formula that every empire would envy: conquest funded conquest. Every campaign fed the next. Every victory produced the resources for another siege, another fleet, another ledger of names erased. The blood of Belgrade became the silver of Rhodes. The silver of Rhodes bought the powder for Hungary. Hungary paid for Cyprus. And so the wheel turned spinning misery into marble. Even the Sultan's own grandeur was part of the same cycle. His robes were dyed with indigo carried by caravans guarded by men once taken in war. His palaces were illuminated by candles moulded from the fat of beasts tended by enslaved shepherds. His throne was built on invisible labour, its wood warm with the touch of 1,000 hands that history never recorded. When travellers later marvelled at the opulence of Topkawa, they saw the surface tile silk music, but not the arithmetic beneath it. They did not see that every curtain was paid for twice, once in coin and once in conscience. The Ottoman genius was not simply military. It was economic, a mastery of how to turn faith into finance, empire into enterprise. The banners of religion fluttered above, but beneath them marched accountants. Behind every call to jihad stood the quiet logic of the market. And so the empire grew nourished not only by the sword but by the balance sheet. Each new conquest promised spiritual glory and delivered financial solvency. The sultan could afford piety precisely because his ledgers were full. The more blood was spilled, the more silver flowed. What began as war became commerce, and what began as commerce became the scaffolding of empire. But soon that scaffolding would need maintenance, a legal framework, an entire ministry devoted to managing human property. The machinery of enslavement was about to evolve from battlefield plunder into bureaucratic permanence. The cannons had gone silent, but the counting had just begun. When the cannons fell silent, another weapon took their place, quieter, colder, and infinitely more enduring the law. What the sword conquered, the pen would keep. The Ottoman Empire did not see itself as a predator devouring the world, but as a divine machine ordered and justified. Its rulers did not speak the language of chaos or bloodlust. They spoke the language of jurisprudence, of thick, sacred law turned into ledger entries. The fate of every captured woman, every orphaned child, every vanquished city was written not merely in memory or rumour, but in the calligraphy of the state. The jurists had a word for it, sabaya. It meant women taken as spoils of war, a term that bridged theology and commerce. Under classical Islamic jurisprudence, a victorious army was permitted to seize the property, and persons of the defeated, provided the ruler sanctioned it, and the spoils were distributed but according to the rules of ghanima, or lawful booty. The Ottomans did not invent this principle. They inherited it, polished it, and applied it with the precision of accountants. In the dim chambers of imperial chancelleries, scholars in turbans debated not the morality of conquest, but its efficiency. Could captives be sold immediately? Must they be offered conversion before enslavement? What share belonged to the sultan, what to the soldiers? The answers were codified in decrees sealed with the tugra, the sultan's curling monogram, half signature, half spell. It was through such documents that the empire turned sin into system. A captured woman was not merely taken, she was processed. Her value, her age, her beauty, her origin, all inscribed onto parchment under the emblem of divine authority. And because it was written, it felt clean. The stain of conquest was transformed into record-keeping. The clerks who performed these tasks were not monsters, they were civil servants. They sharpened their reeds, dipped them into ink, and catalogued human lives with the same calm precision used to count taxes or grain. Their handwriting was graceful, even reverent curves of elegance describing acts of annihilation. The parchment smelled of rosewater and dust as if perfumed to disguise what it carried. Behind them, guards stood, watch spears resting against the walls. The captured women waited in silence, heads bowed, wrists bound. One by one they were summoned to stand before the scribes. A question, a glance, a line of ink, and a human being was transformed into property. Civilization prides itself on order. But in Belgrade, Rhodes, Buda, and Aleppo, order meant the careful division of despair. The empire could not have functioned on chaos. It needed a moral structure to bear the weight of its brutality. The jurists supplied it. They argued that captivity was not cruelty but mercy. Better, they said, to be enslaved under Islam than to perish as an unbeliever. A convenient mercy, one that filled the markets while soothing the conscience of the powerful. Through this logic, domination became duty, the whip an instrument of salvation. And so the Ottoman court became a theatre of paradox, a civilization that built libraries and hospitals, that composed poetry and mosaics of breathtaking beauty, and yet used the same intellect, the same artistry to refine the architecture of subjugation. It was not barbarism disguised as law, it was law that made barbarism respectable. Inside the Topkapi archives today, historians still find these ledgers, fragile pages, ink faded to the colour of old wounds. The script lists thousands of names now lost to history. One girl Greek, 20 years of age, pale complexion, deemed fit for service in the palace. One widow Serbian, 30, strong, billed to be sold in Bursa. Each line is an act of erasure disguised as record. Each word bears the illusion of control. What strikes modern readers most is the tone bureaucratic, serene, almost tender. No anger, no cruelty, no remorse, only the hum of administration, as if humanity itself had been translated into units of value. To those within the empire it was proof of divine order. To those trapped within it, it was a labyrinth from which morality could not escape. A woman could not appeal to faith because faith had already spoken in the sultan's seal, in the scholar's ink, in the silence of the law. Empires like men tell themselves stories to live with their actions. For the Ottomans, the story was that conquest brought civilization, that servitude purified, that hierarchy mirrored heaven. But beneath the polished doctrines and gleaming mosques another truth festered. They had built a world where cruelty could wear the robe of justice. In the palace at Edirne, in the courts of Damascus, in the conquered cities of the Balkans, the ritual was always the same. The prisoners lined up, the scribes wrote, the seals fell like hammer blows, and when the day ended, the officials washed their hands not of blood, but of ink, believing themselves clean. The sword had opened the gates. The pen would keep them shut. When the battle ends, history imagines silence. But after an Ottoman victory, silence was not what followed. It was the sound of counting. The day after Belgrade fell, the smoke still hung over the city like gauze, and the streets pulsed with the strange rhythm of reconstruction and ruin. The dead were left where they lay. The living were gathered, measured, divided. The sorting grounds were usually an open space near the main gate wide enough for hundreds of captives to kneel beneath the sun. The ground was still warm from fire. Flies drifted lazily over the bodies. The smell was a thick mixture of sweat, blood, and roasted grain from the scorched warehouses. Over that, like a strange counterpoint, came another sound pen, scratching over parchment, steady, precise, endless. The scribes sat at wooden tables under makeshift awnings, sleeves rolled up, fingers stained with ink. Next to them stood the Savage officers and clerics, each with a small board to record the living spoils. A group of captives would be ushered forward, guarded by janissaries whose faces betrayed no emotion. The men were stripped of armour or tools, their hands inspected for calluses, their backs for scars. Those deemed strong were bound together for labour or conscription. Those too old or wounded were marked with a single red dot on the parchment, a sign that their value ended there. The women were handled differently. They were lined in rows, veils torn or removed, their names replaced by descriptions, tall dark eyes, perhaps 20, blonde Slavic childbearing age. The clerk would look once briefly, and nod to the officer who recorded the information with the calm of a man inventorying livestock. The youngest was set apart for the elite, the rest divided into categories of use: household work, agriculture, transport, or concubinage. Children were the last to be processed. Some clung to their mothers, others were too stunned to move. Ottoman recruiters assessed them quickly. Those under 10 were sent to holding pens to be sold as future servants, while the strongest boys were tagged for the devshirme, the levy that would someday make them soldiers or bureaucrats in the empire that had just destroyed their world. A witness described one of these catalogues in motion. They wrote as if writing were a prayer, he said. Each name erased a life, and yet the clerks looked peaceful. He might have exaggerated, but the truth lies in the rhythm of that bureaucracy. No shouting, no chaos, only the whisper of the quill and the clink of coin. The empire had found a way to turn conquest into administration. To the Ottomans, this system was order after disorder, justice after war. The sultan's representatives moved through the rows, reading aloud the decisions that determined every destiny. 1/5 for the state, an officer declared his hand on the register, the remainder to be divided among the faithful. Men nodded. Not guards led the chosen groups away, and the marketplace of misery began to take shape. The clerks themselves were trained in this arithmetic of humanity. Many had studied theology and law before entering service. They knew the verses that justified what they did, could quote them fluently, even kindly. To them, the captured were not victims, but participants in divine correction. God had decreed their subjugation. The Sultan merely administered his will. It is easy from the distance of centuries to think of this process as barbaric chaos. But that is its horror. It was not chaos. It was method. Every conquest followed the same choreography. Within hours of the final battle, tents were erected for registration. Separate ledgers were opened for men, women, and children. Notes were made about origin. Serb, Magyar, Greek, alongside physical description, and perceived skill knows spinning, able-bodied, educated. The value of each captive depended not only on beauty or strength, but on what they could produce. The empire had turned humanity into a spreadsheet centuries before spreadsheets existed. As the sun set on the sorting grounds, the day's tallies were carried to the officers' tents. Ink-smudged parchment creased, but the system continued. Caravan masters arrived with wagons. Merchants paid deposits to reserve their shares. The captives were divided again, some to the sultan's court, others to provincial buyers, others still to the long columns that would march toward Bursa Edirne and Constantinople. The heat of the day gave way to a pale dusk. A thin wind lifted the ashes of the burned city and carried them over the kneeling groups. Somewhere a muezzin began the evening call to prayer, his voice trembling above the moans of the bound. It was a haunting juxtaposition, the sound of devotion rising from the same field where human worth was being tabulated. In those moments the empire seemed to merge heaven and commerce into one. The clerks washed their hands in bowls of rosewater, rolled up their ledgers, and bowed toward the city's new mosque, still just a ruin with scaffolding. Around them, torches flickered over the faces of the newly catalogued, who would never again be known by the names they were born with. History often remembers conquests through battle, treaties, and generals, but the true engine of empire was not the sword, it was the desk. The Ottoman conquest endured because it could convert chaos into form bodies, into entries, grief into data. Somewhere in a corner of the field, an old woman whispered prayers in a language none of her captors understood. The clerk nearby paused, dipped his pen again, and drew another line across the parchment. A name vanished. A number appeared. By morning, the records would be sent to Constantinople, bound with silk cord and sealed with wax. The empire's memory was complete. The city's own memory had been erased. The morning after the cataloguing, the process deepened into something colder, an evaluation. The women were gathered in a courtyard where the flag of the crescent fluttered above them. Around them, clerks and physicians assembled, as though for a civic ceremony, their robes immaculate, their instruments polished. The battlefield chaos had given way to an unsettling calm. The empire was now at work. Each woman was brought forward under the supervision of traders and court-appointed examiners. These were men trained not only in medicine, but in pricing men who could appraise a human being with the dispassionate eye of a jeweller. They carried notebooks bound in leather, stamped with the emblem of the sultan, and small brass scales for measuring the worth of jewellery or flesh alike. The first step was the inspection of the face. The physician tilted the captive's chin upward, studying the symmetry of her features, the clarity of her skin. He noted any scars, moles, or marks defects that could lower her price. Then came the mouth. Teeth were checked for health and whiteness. A broken tooth meant diminished value. The hands followed softness or callous, indicated whether she had been accustomed to labour or gentility. Fertility was the final measure, the most invasive, the most demeaning. Midwives under imperial commission performed examinations meant to determine reproductive potential. To the Ottomans, a fertile woman was not just a possession, but a source of future property, a womb that could generate both wealth and servants. The procedure was cloaked in religious legality, yet nothing could disguise its brutality. Records from the 16th century describe these sessions in chilling detail. One Ottoman physician's manual preserved in Istanbul's archives offers a list of categories tays for fresh and youthful order for middling-aged yashla for aged. Each entry corresponded to an approximate price range in silver coins. Another ledger specifies additional columns: origin, religion, health and skill. A formula where humanity dissolved into arithmetic. The cruelty of the process lay not in open violence, but in the precision of its civility. The examiners wore gloves, the scribes bowed before the officers, the captives were offered water between rounds of inspection, as if courtesy could neutralize degradation. Cruelty here was quiet, bureaucratic, perfumed with order. It did not scream, it documented. This kind of appraisal did not begin with the Ottomans. It was the heirloom of empire. The Byzantines had done the same centuries earlier, in the slave markets of Constantinople's Old Quarter, where eunuchs inspected Slavic girls for signs of chastity and fitness to serve noble households. The Persians too had refined their own hierarchies of beauty, maintaining detailed registers for royal harems, complete with notes on complexion, accent and temperament. The Ottomans, inheriting both traditions, combined their efficiency with Islamic jurisprudence, producing a machine of classification so intricate that even cruelty acquired the gloss of legality. What made it enduring was its rationale. To the administrators, this was not barbarity, but stewardship, an extension of divine order into human hierarchy. Just as land was measured for tax, so bodies were measured for value. The same mathematics that governed architecture, trade and astronomy was applied to flesh. Empire, after all, was a geometry of control. Witnesses who later saw these examinations spoke of the unbearable stillness. The women rarely wept. Fear had already settled into something heavier, a numb awareness that each breath might determine their price. Some tried to stand tall to appear strong, believing that dignity might protect them. Others collapsed before their turn came trembling in the heat. The scribes, meanwhile, worked with relentless precision. The sound of their pens was almost soothing scratch, pause, scratch. They wrote as though they were describing fabrics or livestock, fair-skinned, of the Christian faith unblemished, of dark hair, strong build, suitable for domestic labour, young obedient in manner to be reserved for higher purchase. The tone never changed, the ink never trembled. A foreign observer, a Venetian agent who visited the Constantinople markets in the 1530s, recorded the sight in his diary. They value the women as we might assess pearls. There is no anger, no lust, only numbers. The merchants bid as though buying silks. The silence between offers is heavier than any scream. What he witnessed was the final perfection of a system that made cruelty respectable. The Ottoman state did not whip or torment in this stage. It organised. The act of domination became a form of paperwork. The pain was hidden beneath the rustle of parchment and the murmur of clerks reciting numbers under their breath. At sunset, the courtyard emptied. The women had been divided into categories, their worth decided. The most valuable would be sent to Istanbul, their names entered in ledgers bound for the palace treasury. The rest would remain in provincial markets awaiting sale. As the officials packed up their instruments, one scribe carefully blew across his last page to dry the ink. It was the same gesture he might use after copying poetry. The empire prided itself on its beauty, its calligraphy, its architecture, its music. Yet beneath that elegance lay this other art, the art of reducing the infinite to the legible, of translating life into price, and of doing it so gracefully that no one heard the scream. That night the ledgers were sealed with wax and delivered to the treasury office. The figures would be added to the empire's accounts, their profits recorded under the heading of spoils of war. And somewhere in the palace another candle was lit in celebration of victory. Outside, in the stillness of the conquered city, the women slept under guard. Their value determined, their bodies owned their futures already calculated. The pens had stopped moving, but the cruelty they recorded continued to echo soft as parchment, cold as law. The siege was over, but for the captives the road had only just begun. When the Ottoman banners withdrew from Belgrade, the city's surviving women and children were tied together in lines that stretched farther than sight could follow. Iron rings bound to their necks, ropes joined their wrists. They moved not as people, but as inventory in motion, a procession of human goods headed toward the empire's heart. From Belgrade, the route eastward wound through the forests of the Morava Valley down to Sofia, then on to Edirne, the great staging post of empire, before finally reaching Constantinople. It was a road worn smooth by centuries of conquest, the arteries through which human life flowed toward markets and palaces. The first days were always the worst. The soldiers walked ahead, their armour glinting under the sun, while the captives stumbled behind them through mud and ash. Each dawn a drum signalled movement. Each dusk the column halted near a stream or field where they would sleep in clusters, hands still bound. The weak fell early. The old were left behind. No one stopped to bury them, not out of cruelty but efficiency. The empire had learned long ago that mercy delayed profit. For those who survived, hunger became both punishment and teacher. Rations were given sparingly, a handful of barley, a sip of water. Mothers tried to chew bark and soften it in their mouths for their children. The air itself seemed to dry their voices, until conversation became little more than the sound of feet dragging in dust. Eyewitnesses wrote that one could follow such caravans by scent alone. The stench of sweat iron and rot marked their passing, mingling with the sweet decay of summer fields. Along the way, local peasants watched from doorway behind, terrified, sometimes pitying, but never intervening. To aid a captive was to invite the same chains. At the checkpoints, Ottoman officials appeared with scrolls and ink pots. They verified counts, noted deaths, added replacements from nearby villages. Even in movement, bureaucracy remained. The records had to balance. One of the women whose story survives only in fragments left behind a testimony dictated years later to a Venetian priest. Her name had once been Caterina. She was 21 when Belgrade fell. The road was long, she said. We walked through forests where the birds did not sing. At night I dreamed I was still home, that my mother called my name. But each morning the ropes burned my skin again, and I knew I was already erased. There was a girl beside me, no more than 15. She stopped speaking after 3 days. The soldier behind us prodded her with his spear. When she did not move, he cut the rope and left her in the ditch. I do not remember her face, only her hand open, palm up as if still waiting for help. Her account, though brief, matches dozens of others, the same rhythm of loss, the same quiet horror. Some captives prayed, others forgot how. The further they travelled, the more their world shrank to a single horizon. The next step, the next breath, the next command shouted in a language they didn't understand. In Edern, the caravan paused. Their imperial clerks inspected the survivors, recounted them, and reattached identification tags, thin metal discs engraved with numbers. The journey from battlefield to market was also a journey through the Empire's chain of custody. By the time they reached the capital, each captive had been recorded at least 3 times. The surviving children, many too young to grasp their fate, clung to strangers who had become family through misery. Traders marked them with chalk to indicate future sale. Some would be trained as servants, others absorbed into the palace schools. They were told their past was over, that they would forget their names, and many did. For the women, the march was a crucifixion stretched over weeks. Their backs bent under heat and fear, their feet blistered on the stones. Those who lagged behind were struck or abandoned. Each river they crossed carried away a part of who they had been. By the time the Sea of Marmara appeared on the horizon, they no longer spoke in words but in gestures, a look, a nod, a shared sip of rainwater. When the columns finally entered Constantinople, the city greeted them not with pity but with commerce. In the distance rose the domes of Hagia Sophia and the towers of Tokat's palace, symbols of faith and power. To the captives they looked like mirages, beautiful, unreachable, indifferent. The gates of the slave market at Eminonu opened like the mouth of a waiting beast. It was said that the sound of chains on the cobblestones blended with the bells of the harbour. Merchants, officials and buyers lined the streets discussing prices as casually as weather. The captives were untied, washed and distributed to holding pens. A clerk dipped his quill into ink, ready to begin the next phase of valuation sale assimilation. But for the survivors, especially the few who would later escape or be freed, the road never ended. Katerina's final words, recorded years later, carried the ache of that march still within them. When I hear iron strike stone, I remember the chains. When I smell rain on dust, I see the road again. They took everything, my name, my tongue, my mother's song. But sometimes when the wind blows east, I think I hear her voice still walking beside me. The Ottomans called it transfer of spoils. History would call it logistics. To those who walked it, it was simply the road to disappearance. When the caravans reached the capital, their chains did not fall away, they only changed shape. The slave markets of the Ottoman Empire were not back alleys of cruelty, they were architectural institutions as permanent as mosques, as regulated as banks. The largest of them stood in Constantinople's Eminonu district near the Golden Horn. It was not hidden. It was part of the city's rhythm, a place where commerce and faith met under the same sky. From a distance, the market seemed almost festive. Whitewashed walls, arched gates, domes, glinting in the sunlight. Merchants shouted prices beside stalls selling spices, silk and coffee. The air carried the scent of saffron rosewater and sweat. But as one drew nearer, the illusion fractured. The fragrance thinned. Beneath it came the smell of iron dust and fear. The interior of the Asir Pazara, the slave bazaar, was arranged like a theatre of human exchange. Along the colonnades stood cages and shaded pens where men, women and children were kept. Some sat silent, heads bowed. Others whispered prayers or lullabies. In the centre courtyard, traders gathered around the newest arrivals, their ledgers open, abacuses clicking softly. The auctions followed a ritual as old as empire. A crier stood on a raised platform and called out descriptions, origin, age, skill, beauty. The buyers moved among the captives with professional detachment, lifting chins, inspecting teeth, touching arms and hair to judge texture. Every gesture was polite, deliberate, practiced. The women were told to smile. Those who could sing or embroider were instructed to demonstrate. Value was performance, silence cost dearly. Coins clinked against stone floors, the sound echoed like rain, rhythmic, mechanical. When a sale was complete, a scribe stepped forward to draft the contract. Ottoman law required documentation for every transaction. Buyer, seller and witness each signed beneath the tukra, the sultan's emblem, ensuring the act was both commercial and divine. This was how barbarity became business. Each contract included guarantees clauses that mirrored the sophistication of the empire's trade system. If a captive fell ill or died within 10 days of purchase, the buyer could demand restitution. If she was found barren after a month, her value could be renegotiated. A notary registered the complaint. A physician certified the claim. The same empire that had turned people into property also gave that property consumer protection. In the side galleries, brokers specialized by region and religion. Circassian and Georgian women fetched the highest prices for their reputation of beauty. Slavic women were valued for endurance. Greeks for domestic skills. Young boys were sold separately prized for their potential as servants or soldiers. Muslim buyers were forbidden to enslave other Muslims, but conversions often blurred this rule. A Christian name could disappear with a few drops of ink. One Venetian observer described the Constantinople market with unsettling precision. The hall is full of colour carpets, robes gold, yet I have never seen a place more grey. The women stand behind wooden lattices, their faces half hidden. A merchant lifts the veil of one, and her eyes are empty like those of a statue that has been made to weep. Other cities followed the same model. Bursa, with its domed market near the Ulukami Mosque, was known for its second-tier trades, the reselling of captives who failed to meet palace standards. Ankara''s smaller bazaars dealt mainly in domestic labourers and field workers for Anatolian estates. The same rules applied everywhere. Record the sale, stamp the contract, remit the tax. A tenth of each transaction went to the imperial treasury, transforming despair into revenue. By mid-afternoon, the heat inside the Eminönü bazaar was suffocating. Dust rose with every step. The sunlight filtered through the wooden slats, striping the captives' faces with bars of gold. A faint hum filled the air, not conversation, not chant, but the collective murmur of hundreds breathing in resignation. Above them, pigeons circled the domes, their wings flashing silver. Life and death moved side by side, each unaware of the other. At the close of the day, the unsold were locked in holding chambers, long halls lined with straw mats. Guards walked the corridors, keys jangling. Outside, the city's call to prayer rang out, echoing through the bazaar. For a brief moment, even the traders paused, bowing their heads toward Mecca. The captives watched in silence, wondering what mercy could mean in a place built upon prayer and profit. In Ottoman culture, merchants often quoted scripture to justify their trade. One favourite verse came from the Quran's Surah An-Nahl. And of his signs is the diversity of your languages and your colours. They recited it as a celebration of the world's variety, forgetting that within those same walls, diversity had been turned into currency. The bureaucracy surrounding the trade extended beyond the markets. Specialised guilds handled transport inspection and resale. Taxes were collected at every stage. Even the scribes who recorded the transactions paid fees for their licenses. The empire had transformed the oldest sin, the buying and selling of people, into a pillar of its economy, reinforced by law ritual and the comforting illusion of order. For the captives, the market was a final crucible. The long march had stripped them of hope. The bazaar stripped them of identity. Once the contract was signed, a new name would be assigned, often Turkish or Arabic, a brand of belonging to someone else's story. The women left the market not as individuals, but as entries in someone's household ledger. Fatma, housemaid; Layla, singer; Aisha, concubine. At sunset, when the last buyers departed and the stalls were swept clean, the courtyard glowed in the orange light. The scribes stacked their ledgers, the traders locked their coffers. Outside, the Bosphorus shimmered, carrying ships east and west, the empire's veins pulsing with trade. Behind the closed gates, the voices of the unsold whispered through the dark. They spoke in fragments of their native tongues, Hungarian, Greek, Serbian languages that would soon be forbidden to them. In that mingling of sound, grief and memory, intertwined like smoke. The Ottomans called it commerce. History remembers it differently. It was the market where humanity itself was auctioned, and civilization applauded the price. If the slave markets were the empire's engine, the harems were its theatre, a gilded stage where power hid behind silks and shadows. The Western world would later turn them into fantasies' cushions, perfumes, languid beauty under golden lamps. Pain was painted over with desire. But within the walls of the imperial harem at Topkapi Palace, the truth was colder, a geometry of control dressed in luxury's costume. The harem was not one vast pleasure chamber, but a labyrinth of corridors, courtyards, and barred rooms, built deep within the palace, guarded day and night by eunuchs who had themselves been mutilated by the same system. Its walls were high, its windows latticed to filter sight but not the sound. The women could hear the sea through the marble latticework but never see it. The outside world existed only as rumour. At its peak, the imperial harem housed nearly 2,000 women concubines, attendants, tutors and slaves, each classified by rank and proximity to the sultan. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, who ruled the inner court with absolute authority. Below her were the Kadun Effendis, the official consorts who had borne sons. Then the Iqbals and Guzdi's favourites, who competed daily for a glance, a smile or a word. At the bottom were the new arrivals' captives who had survived the market, and now began the slow erasure of self required to survive the palace. Every detail of their lives was regulated. They rose before dawn for prayers bathed in silence and spent the morning in lessons, language, embroidery, music, etiquette. Teachers drilled them not only in Turkish, but in the subtle codes of court behaviour, how to bow, how to walk, how to hide emotion. The harem was not a house of leisure, but an academy of submission. To outsiders, the word harem implied pleasure. Inside it meant vigilance. Eyes were everywhere, the chief black eunuch, the chamber guards, the matrons who monitored conversation. Affection could be fatal, friendship could be a weapon. Each woman lived in the knowledge that one wrong gesture could end in exile or execution. Still, the illusion of paradise was maintained. Gold leaf gleamed on ceilings, fountains murmured in courtyards, rose water perfumed the air. The women's chambers were lined with Iznik tiles painted in floral patterns so intricate they seemed to breathe. Beauty was both comfort and trap. Every mosaic, every scent, every rule whispered the same message: you belong here and nowhere else. Some women adapted climbing the invisible ladder through obedience and charm. Others rebelled in silence by remembering their native tongue, by whispering forbidden prayers at night, by keeping a scrap of cloth from their homeland hidden beneath their mattress. Those tiny acts of defiance became their only proof of existence. To the Sultan, the harem was more than pleasure. It was politics. Every woman inside represented a potential alliance, a womb for dynastic succession, or a threat to stability. The harem was a living map of empire: Circassian, Greek, Albanian, Georgian, Hungarian, Persian. The conquered nations reassembled in miniature. Their daughters were made as instruments of the ruler's lineage. Historians now recognize what poets ignored. The harem was a state within a state. Its hierarchy mirrored the bureaucracy: outside ranks, titles, officials, regulations. Even its architecture symbolized control. The further one moved inward, the higher the privilege. The deepest chambers closest to the Sultan's quarters were the most confined. The women who reached those inner rooms lived in rooms lined with velvet, but their world had shrunk to the size of a few paces. Visitors were forbidden. The only men allowed beyond the threshold were the eunuchs, loyal, voiceless, invisible. Their presence ensured separation between ruler and ruled, man and woman, desire and fear. Many of these eunuchs had been taken as children from Africa or the Balkans, castrated and trained for a lifetime of silent obedience. They too were captives, their power derived from proximity to the Sultan's will. Occasionally the Sultan would walk through the harem's hall of mirrors, where torches reflected endlessly in polished metal. The women knelt as he passed, eyes lowered. To look directly at him without permission was punishable by death. And yet to not be noticed was another kind of death, the slow erasure of being unseen. The most coveted role was that of a Seki Sultan, the Sultan's chosen favourite, often elevated to near royal status. She might command servants' own estates, even influence politics through whispers. But her power was never her own. It flowed only as long as the Sultan's desire endured. When it faded, she could be dismissed overnight to the old palace, the silent exile for women who had outlived their usefulness. The empire's poets called the harem a garden of roses, but even roses behind those walls were trimmed and numbered. The songs sung within were in minor keys filled with longing, for skies they could not see. One Italian visitor wrote that the palace smelled of jasmine and sorrow, a place where the air itself has learned to obey, and yet from this gilded cage, history's shadows emerged. Some women mastered the system that imprisoned them. They learned its language, its politics, its rituals. A few would rise to wield immense influence, shaping alliances, commanding armies through their sons, bending the fate of empires. From this crucible of captivity came women like Hürrem Sultan, once a Ruthenian slave, later the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. But in the century of Belgrade's fall, those triumphs were rare. For most, the harem was a slow drowning in beauty. Every corridor gleamed, every fountain sang, every tile shimmered, yet all of it spoke of control. The palace walls glittered with light, but none of it reached the soul. To walk through the harem today is to feel the echo of that paradox. The marble floors are cold, the chambers immaculate, the silence thick. Tourists see elegance, ghosts remember confinement. The empire built these prisons out of luxury so that captivity might look like paradise. Because power at its most refined does not shout. It smiles behind a veil. Before chains could be removed, minds had to be remade. The Ottoman state understood something every empire before it had discovered conquest was not complete until memory itself was conquered. The markets had sold the body, but the harem, the household, and the madrasa would purchase the soul. Upon arrival at their final destinations, the captives underwent a ceremony called Tekdid-i-Iman, renewal of faith, which was in truth a ceremony of forgetting. The women were stripped of their names, bathed in rosewater scented with musk, and dressed in fresh linen robes. The attendants whispered blessings in Arabic, a language most of them did not understand, and declared them new daughters of Islam. The women's old names were never spoken again. Katerina became Aisha, Helena became Layla, Anna became Zainab. It was not only a change of name, it was an exorcism of the past. Their new identities were recorded in the palace registers beside the date of their conversion. A mark of piety for the empire, a wound of dislocation for the captive. The transformation was made to look merciful, a cleansing, a rebirth, but in truth it was annihilation disguised as grace. Language followed next. Within weeks the women were forbidden to speak their native tongues. To be caught whispering in Greek Serbian or Ruthenian was to be whipped or confined without food. Teachers drilled Turkish into their mouths until it replaced the taste of their first language. Every sentence spoken correctly was rewarded with dates or coins, every mistake with silence or pain. Slowly their inner voices, the ones that remembered lullabies and family names, faded beneath the weight of foreign syllables. Religion too was rewritten. The captives were taught to recite prayers they did not yet believe, to bow toward a direction that once meant nothing to them. Those who resisted conversion were isolated, deprived of sleep, or left to kneel for hours in dark chambers, lit only by a single oil lamp. The Ottomans called it discipline. Modern psychologists would call it conditioning. Over time, the rituals of obedience became automatic. The women rose at dawn for ablutions, that their movements synchronized like choreography. They learned the gestures of submission so perfectly that even defiance could no longer find a language. That was the final victory, when fear gave way to reflex, and reflex became identity. One of the palace eunuchs once wrote in a private note later discovered, "In his confiscated correspondence, when they arrive, they cry for home. After a year, they no longer remember which home they mean." The psychological violence of this process cannot be overstated. Modern trauma studies call it identity fragmentation. The mind splits itself to survive, creating compartments of memory that can never fully meet. For the captives, the only way to endure was to bury the person they had been. The Ottomans did not need whips once that burial was complete. The captives policed themselves. This method of assimilation had ancient precedents. The Romans practiced a similar strategy with their enslaved populations. Foreign captives in Rome were renamed, branded, and instructed in Latin so that even their thoughts would conform to the empire's grammar. Mongol Khans had perfected another variant centuries earlier, the adoption of conquered princes and princesses into their courts, where the foal were given new names and trained to serve the very system that had destroyed their kingdoms. Power knew no invention more enduring than forced conversion. In the Ottoman world, the process took on the rhythm of ritual. On Fridays, new converts were assembled in courtyards for public affirmation. A cleric would read a verse from the Quran, and each captive, trembling, would repeat the Shahada, the declaration of faith. The crowd responded with Allahu Akbar, the echo rising to the palace walls. From that moment onward, she was no longer a captive of war, but a believer. In the empire's eyes, she had been elevated. In her own, she had vanished. Some women clung to fragments of their old selves in secret. They embroidered crosses into hidden hems, whispered forbidden prayers while washing the marble floors, or kept a single strand of hair uncut as a silent vow. These small rebellions became their only proof that something of them still lived. Others succumbed, entirely building new selves from obedience. To survive was to adapt, to learn the etiquette of subservience until it resembled grace. They mastered the art of silence, the language of lowered eyes, the choreography of invisibility. Some even rose in rank, rewarded for their docility, granted silk robes, even jewels, the empire's strange form of compensation for the theft of a soul. Historians often describe the Ottoman system as efficient, but efficiency is merely the polite word for what happens when cruelty learns administration. The process of cultural erasure was not improvised, it was institutional. Officials kept records of every conversion, every renaming, every oath. Each act of forgetting was written, signed, stamped, and sealed. In time, the women began to speak of their old lives as if they belonged to someone else. Memory became a ghost that followed them through the corridors of Top Caper, invisible, persistent, sometimes mercifully silent. A chronicler who toured the harem in the late 16th century wrote of this atmosphere with uneasy admiration. The women here move as if in prayer. Their eyes hold neither joy nor grief. It is as if the empire has found a way to breed serenity out of surrender. That serenity was the illusion of course, a mask worn by minds that had learned to survive behind obedience. Beneath the jewelled garments, trauma pulsed like a hidden wound. The body remembered what the mind was forced to forget. And so the Ottoman system achieved what every empire dreams of: subjects who no longer needed chains because they had accepted the empire's reflection as their own. The Romans had called it civitas. The Mongols called it service. The Ottomans, more elegantly, called it faith. But for those who lived it, it was simply disappearance, the slow, silent erasure of self beneath the script of someone else's world. Empires that run on obedience must also run on fear. In the Ottoman world, the beauty of the palace and the harmony of the law were upheld by an unspoken instrument, pain. The empire's architects understood that power needed spectacle, but control needed silence. Torture was not chaos here. It was choreography. It was policy. Within the walls of Topkapi, resistance was rare, but never absent. Some captives tried to flee through kitchens or courtyards. Others refused conversion, clinging to prayers from their old faiths. And a few, driven beyond endurance, struck at their captors or themselves. For each act of defiance, the empire had an answer delivered not in rage but in procedure. The punishments began with deprivation. A woman who disobeyed could be confined for days without food or water, left in a narrow cell where light came through a slit no wider than a finger. She would hear the fountains outside, the footsteps of guards, the laughter of others at prayer, or play the sounds of life made unreachable. Those who still resisted were subjected to Karanlık Odası, the dark chamber. There, in complete blackness, she would be kept for days, sometimes weeks, until her voice broke into whispers to no one. Public punishments followed a ritual precision. The harem's inner courtyard doubled as its stage of warning. There, before assembled women, the disobedient were brought out and struck with rods across the soles of their feet, Falaka, the ancient method of humiliation. It left no visible scars, only agony. The lesson was clear. Beauty may be prized, but obedience was priceless. Such displays were not constant. They did not need to be. One example sustained fear for months. Officials understood that terror works best in memory, not repetition. The punishment was usually accompanied by prayer, the overseer reciting verses between blows, as if sanctifying the act. Pain in this system became theology. When rebellion did occur, the response was swift and absolute. One account recorded by a court chronicler in 1542 tells of a collective defiance among 12 harem servants who refused conversion after months of confinement. They had been captured from a fortress near Buda Hungarian Christians who swore they would not renounce their god. Smuggled rosaries were found hidden in their bedding. They were brought before the chief black eunuch Kızlar Ağası, who presided as judge and executioner. Witnesses recalled that his voice was calm, almost gentle, as he asked each woman to repeat the Shahada. They refused. The first was struck. The second spat in his face. The third began to sing a hymn, and the others joined her. Their voices rising, fragile, defiant, echoing through marble halls built for silence. It was over quickly. The ringleaders were taken to the palace's underground cisterns, bound and drowned. The rest were sent to provincial estates as labourers. Their names disappeared from the records, replaced by a single note in the ledger: rebellion extinguished. Even centuries later, those two words still feel heavy. They reveal what terror truly seeks: not destruction, but erasure. Death was never the goal. Transformation was. The pain was a language, a grammar of submission written on the body. In totalitarian systems, pain always becomes a kind of speech, a dialect of warning that needs no translation. The scream of one victim speaks for 1,000 observers. Every whip crack says this is what happens when you forget who owns you. The Ottomans mastered that grammar as meticulously as they mastered calligraphy. For the administrators, cruelty was not a failure of virtue, but a tool of harmony. Fear maintained order more efficiently than faith. A frightened subject prayed harder, obeyed faster, spoke softer. Pain became the invisible ink that held the empire's script together. And yet even within this architecture of fear, the human spirit sometimes rebelled in quieter ways. Some women starved themselves, slowly choosing death over submission. Others sang in forbidden languages, carving rebellion into melody. A few scratched small crosses or pagan symbols into the undersides of furniture, hidden graffiti that outlived them. In those gestures, the empire's perfection cracked, if only for a heartbeat. Still, for every act of defiance, the machinery of terror adjusted and refined itself. The Ottomans had inherited their methods from many empires before them, the Byzantine blinding, the Persian bastinado, the Roman crucifixion by proxy, but they perfected the bureaucratic version, punishment documented, justified and archived. Every act of violence had a witness, a record, a seal. What made it terrifying was not the cruelty itself, but its civility. The executioner bowed before striking. The scribe wrote his report in careful calligraphy. The guards prayed before locking the cell. The empire's power was not in its brutality, but in its belief that brutality could coexist with grace, and so beneath the golden domes and perfumed halls, fear became the empire's most fluent language. It required no translation, no teaching. Every footstep on marble echoed its grammar. Every whisper in the corridors was its echo. The empire had learned to make obedience sound like devotion and pain feel like order. Empires do not survive on cruelty alone. They endure because they learn how to count it. Behind every scream that once echoed through Belgrade Bursa or the corridors of Top Caper, there existed a ledger, a quiet page where pain was transformed into arithmetic. The Ottomans' masters of bureaucracy did not leave suffering to rumour. They filed it, stamped it, sealed it in ink. In the imperial chancelleries of Constantinople, scribes worked by lamplight, their desks stacked with parchment and registers bound in leather. Quills scratched softly across pages, a sound like rain falling on distant graves. Each stroke of ink was a transaction of despair. They recorded not the lives of captives, but their values. Age, skill, origin, price condition, all reduced to elegant lines of Ottoman calligraphy. The ledgers were organised by region. There were volumes for the Balkans, for the Caucasus, for Anatolia. Inside the script gleamed like dark veins. One girl, Greek, aged 17, sound of limb, skilled in embroidery, 30 silver pieces, Boytorcassian sage, unknown, fair complexion, apt for service, 25 silver pieces. Each entry was exact, aesthetic, almost beautiful. Cruelty written with grace that was the Ottoman genius. The bureaucrats prided themselves on this precision. It proved they believed that their system was civilized. Even the enslaved, they said, deserved accurate accounting. Accuracy became morality, documentation became virtue. The ink, thick and black, dried slowly on the page, a substitute for blood that could be touched without guilt. That ink was everywhere. It ran through the empire's veins as surely as the Bosphorus ran through its heart. Every sale in the Essia Pazara was taxed. Every transfer between households was notarized. The state received its 10th, the resm e penshek, the royal 5th, and the scribes tallied it in immaculate columns. Numbers grew where names vanished. From these records, the empire built an entire economy of despair. Provincial governors received quotas. How many slaves could be exported to Cairo or Aleppo? How many kept for internal service? Treasury clerks converted these figures into projections calculating revenues for the next fiscal year. There were memos discussing the decline in Circassian supply and budget notes lamenting damage to trade routes from plague. Even human misery had quarterly reports. To read these archives today is to enter a world where empathy has been replaced by balance sheets. One document from 1564 lists the Sultan's personal acquisitions that year: 46 women, 12 boys, and 4 men of notable talent. Next to each entry, a brief annotation: satisfactory, unsuitable, requires retraining. The script is neat. The cruelty is bureaucratic. There is a terrible cleanliness to this kind of evil. Paper absorbs guilt the way earth absorbs blood quietly, completely. The scribe could dip his pen in the inkwell and tell himself he had touched nothing unholy. He was not the one who whipped or sold or branded. He was merely recording, serving the state, preserving order. That was the secret purpose of bureaucracy, to create distance between the hand that wounds and the hand that writes. Once suffering becomes data, it no longer screams, and so the empire functioned like a living organism. The soldiers captured, the merchants purchased, the scribes recorded, the treasurers counted, the jurists justified. Each part believed itself blameless because it did not perform the other's task. This was the Ottoman miracle, not in art or architecture, but in moral division. Even the records themselves were works of beauty. The pages were lined in gold borders, the script in flowing Divani style, every stroke a small act of devotion. The same hand that wrote verses of the Quran in the illuminated manuscripts also wrote the sale price of a child. It is difficult to tell centuries later which ink belonged to which. Occasionally an anomaly appears in these documents, a note in the margin, a smudge, a hesitation. Perhaps a clerk paused before writing a child's age. Perhaps he looked up, saw his own reflection in the polished brass inkstand, and wondered briefly who would one day read these pages. Then he would continue the quill, steady the line completed. The silence of the victims deepened as the records multiplied. Every page that preserved their existence also erased their voices. In the Empire's archives there are no cries, no prayers, no names beyond their first descriptions. What remains is the echo of calculation ink in place of blood columns, where once there were faces. Historians have described this system as one of the earliest forms of data governance, but to call it that is to miss its moral dimension. These were not merely records of trade, they were confessions of civilization's blindness, evidence that the pursuit of order can coexist with the destruction of empathy. One Ottoman poet writing in secret hinted at this dissonance. They write in black what they have taken in red. The pen drinks from the wound and calls it art. The empire would last for centuries, more sustained by its own paperwork, a labyrinth of documents that made conquest look like accounting. The true monuments of Ottoman power were not its mosques or palaces, but its archives, shelves upon shelves of lives turned into ink. And even now, in the quiet of those archives, the pages whisper. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them breathe, the soft rustle of parchment, the faint rhythm of counting. And beneath it the silence of those who were written out of the world so carefully that history mistook their absence for order. Among the endless rows of prisoners taken from conquered cities, one group received special attention, the wives and daughters of the defeated elite. To enslave a farmer's widow brought profit. To enslave a general's wife brought theatre. These women were not sold in common markets. They were reserved for spectacle paraded before victors to demonstrate the complete collapse of resistance. In their humiliation, the empire found its mirror proof that no birth, no title, no lineage could shield anyone from submission. After the fall of Belgrade, among the thousands processed, a handful of names appeared in the imperial lists marked with a symbol, a crescent drawn in red ink. Those were the women of rank. The widow of a Hungarian commander, the sister of a Serbian noble, the daughter of a Wallachian prince. They were separated from the masses and sent east under special guard. When they entered, Adern crowds gathered to watch their procession. Silk gowns, torn and resewn into rough uniforms of linen jewels, confiscated heads uncovered beneath the Anatolian sun. Their arrival at Topkapi was recorded in official prose. 4 captives of noble stock presented to the imperial harem as gifts of conquest. Nothing more, no names, no faces, yet through other accounts a guard's memoir, a merchant's letter. A fragment of Venetian correspondence, the outlines of one life emerge. Her name before the war was Ilona Kovac, daughter of a Hungarian count. She had been 24 when Belgrade fell. She spoke 3 languages, could play the lute, and had once ridden horses along the banks of the Danube. After her husband's death in battle, she was captured and sent to Constantinople as part of the Sultan's Pensic tribute, the royal fifth of the spoils. The journey took months. She arrived at Topkapi with hair shorn to the shoulders and wrists raw from rope. The court physicians examined her as they did all captives. Declared fit for service, she was placed under the supervision of the harem tutors and given a new name, Huma Hatun, the Bird of Paradise. It was an irony the scribes likely enjoyed to rename grief with beauty. Her duties were ceremonial at first. She learned to pour coffee, to bow, to recite the Sultan's titles. She embroidered Quranic verses she could not read. But she was also displayed not in chains but in silence during receptions where foreign envoys were received. Her presence was the part of the message the empire conquers not just cities but lineages. The chroniclers who served the palace seldom wrote of what followed, yet rumours drifted through European courts. They said Ilona had been offered as a companion to one of the Sultan's viziers, a man twice her age who collected books and wives with equal indifference. They said she spoke little, ate little, and spent hours gazing towards the Bosphorus as if trying to find the colour of the Danube in its waters. Whether she lived or died in the palace, history does not record. But the ledgers remember her as an entry-one woman, fair, foreign, gifted in needlework. Her fate was not unique. The empire prized noble captives because their subjugation sent ripples through defeated lands. When news reached Hungary or Serbia that the wives of their commanders now served as attendants or concubines, morale collapsed. The humiliation became policy. Yet this logic of cruelty was not uniquely Ottoman. Across medieval Europe, hostage-taking was its own ritual of dominance. English kings held the sons of Welsh princes in their courts, raising them as both guests and hostages. French crusaders carried Byzantine princesses to Paris and called it ransom. In the Mongol steppe, captured noble women were given to Khans as symbols of conquest, their marriages sealing the extinction of old dynasties. The difference was only in ornament, not in intent. The human need to display victory through the suffering of the exalted was a constant in every empire's vocabulary. What makes the Ottoman example distinct is its polish, the transformation of degradation into ceremony. In Europe, hostages were kept in towers. In Istanbul, they were dressed in silk. The humiliation was aestheticized. The conqueror's mercy became another form of control, a visible act of generosity that concealed the total absence of freedom. Inside the palace, noble captives lived in rooms brighter than most cathedrals, yet dimmer than any memory. They were allowed to eat, to read, even to laugh, so long as it was under supervision. A guard's report from 1550 describes a Christian woman of notable birth who sings at the fountain in the third courtyard. Perhaps this was Ilona. Perhaps it was another. Either way, the empire had achieved the same effect, the transformation of power into music, obedience into art. The eunuchs who guarded them often spoke kindly, bringing figs or wine. Small comforts that blurred the edge of captivity. Over time, gratitude replaced hatred. Some converted willingly, others through exhaustion. A few bore children whose names would join the imperial genealogies, their bloodline disappearing into the Ottoman silk of lineage. Through them, the conquered became the conqueror's kin, a paradox as old as empire itself. Ilona's story, and those like hers, reveals the strange arithmetic of domination. The empire understood that a broken commoner could be replaced, but a broken noble could break nations. To parade her submission was to write history in flesh. And in doing so, the Ottomans joined a fraternity of civilizations that all discovered the same truth-cruelty when dressed in ritual looks remarkably like order. Centuries later, in the frescoed halls of European courts, portraits of vanished noblewomen still hang, their faces serene, their hands folded, their gazes fixed on horizons they never reached. Somewhere among them, perhaps, is the faint echo of those who vanished behind the gates of Topkapi, their names translated, their voices erased. They were trophies disguised as servant symbols, mistaken for people, and their silence, refined, perfumed, and rehearsed, became the empire's most eloquent victory. Empires have many currencies: gold, silver, labour fear, but the most enduring one is birth. When the Ottoman state perfected its system of captivity, it discovered that a conquered womb could yield not just one life, but generations of profit. The women taken in war were not only commodities to be traded, they were engines of continuity, producing new bodies to replace the fallen, and to serve the throne that had destroyed their families. In the law books, this process had a name: al-Walad, the mother of a child. A woman enslaved who bore her master's son could not be sold yet. Her child belonged wholly to him. It was a legal sleight of hand that turned motherhood into ownership. A child's first breath was also his first act of servitude. Birth became both miracle and ledger entry. For the Ottoman elite, this was not an accident of passion. It was a mechanism of governance. The harem's upper ranks, filled with converted concubines, supplied the dynasty's heirs, while the lower tiers produced servants and attendants. Outside the palace, thousands of enslaved women across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Levant were forced into unions. Some ritualized, others brutal, designed to generate labor for estate soldiers, for armies, and attendants for the growing machinery of empire. The children of these unions formed a grey class, neither free nor foreign. Their identities dissolved before they could form. Those born in palace households were raised as loyal servants, educated in the customs of their masters. Others born on provincial estates became agricultural serfs, artisans, or domestic workers. For them, slavery was not a condition to escape. It was the only world they knew. It was an economy of reproduction, a system that taxed the very act of life. Every birth was an investment, every cradle a calculation. Women became state assets, their fertility measured as a form of revenue. To the scribes of the empire, the population of enslaved children was not tragedy but productivity. Reports described renewal through offspring, a phrase as cold as it was efficient. The consequences rippled outward across generations. Entire regions of the Balkans, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Macedonia, were drained of women of childbearing age. Villages where laughter once filled the evenings grew sent their hearths cold. Men returned from war to find not only their wives gone, but the possibility of a future erased. The demographic wounds lasted centuries. Some never healed. Missionaries who travelled through the borderlands in the late 16th century described landscapes of absence. The women have vanished, one Franciscan wrote. Only the old and the very young remain like branches after the tree has been stripped. It was not famine or plague that had hollowed these lands, but the mathematics of empire. The Ottoman machine had found a way to convert motherhood into infrastructure. Inside the harem, the paradox deepened. The same women who were denied freedom were celebrated for their fertility. Those who bore sons were elevated, granted tiun titles, jewellery and attendants tokens of power that was never truly their own. Their children might rise to positions of influence, but their mothers remained property, their bodies the foundation stones of dynastic legitimacy. In time, this cycle of coerced motherhood became so normalised that it no longer registered as cruelty. Midwives recorded births with pride, tutors educated the resulting children in court etiquette, and jurists debated inheritance rights for sons born of slaves. The empire had clothed exploitation in the language of destiny. And yet beneath this logic a darker truth thrummed every heir, every servant, every soldier who traced his lineage to a concubine carried within him the silent inheritance of coercion. Bloodlines built on conquest carry conquest forward even when memory fails. To modern eyes, this pattern resembles what sociologists now call generational trauma, the transmission of suffering across time. The mothers who bore children in captivity often withdrew emotionally to survive, creating legacies of distance, silence, and fragmentation that passed invisibly to their descendants. The children raised to believe their bondage was loyalty grew into adults unable to recognize their loss. The system endured precisely because it taught those inside it to mistake captivity for belonging. It was in essence birth as taxation, the state's quietest form of collection. Instead of coins, it demanded futures. Every infant born to a captive mother paid a debt his people had never agreed to owe. The womb replaced the battlefield as the empire's frontier, expanding its dominion not through conquest but through conception. The human cost is impossible to count, though the numbers survive in fragments. Ottoman census records list sudden population declines across Balkan districts between the 16th and 17th centuries. In some regions, female populations dropped by half within a generation. The empire's accountants noted this as a labour imbalance, not as grief. Paper turned agony into metrics, and so the empire grew nourished not just by the blood of war, but by the milk of its captives. The same bureaucracy that catalogued women in the markets now tracked their children in the schools and barracks. Every birth extended the reach of the sultan's will, binding the next generation to his court before they could speak their own names. Historians often describe the Ottoman system as pragmatic, but pragmatism is simply the word cruelty uses when it becomes successful. The empire's administrators had discovered the most efficient form of dominion, one that began with desire, ended with debt, and repeated itself through every generation born into the illusion of belonging. And in the quiet rooms where those mothers laboured behind the silk screens beneath the painted ceilings, the air itself seemed to hold a paradox. Life and captivity shared the same breath. The cries of newborns echoed through corridors perfumed with jasmine, and somewhere beyond the walls the Bosphorus shimmered, carrying away the sound of another life claimed by empire. In the empire's hierarchy of domination there was one act more final than the loss of freedom, the loss of self before God. The Ottomans called it tekdid-i iman, the renewal of faith. To the clerics and jurists it was an act of mercy, the salvation of a soul from unbelief. To the captives it was the quietest violence, a ritual that disguised humiliation as holiness. The conversion ceremony was meticulously staged. The setting was rarely a grand mosque, but a courtyard, a chamber, or sometimes the open square of a fortress newly conquered. A cleric in white robes stood before a line of captives. The women were told to wash their hands and faces with water poured from brass ewers, a symbolic cleansing. They were then wrapped in plain linen veils and instructed to kneel. To the officials observing it resembled piety. To the captives it felt like burial. The cleric recited verses from the Quran, while attendants translated reducing sacred poetry to commands, "Repeat after me, say the words, believe and you will be spared." The captives repeated not out of belief but out of exhaustion. Each phrase of the Shahada was coaxed through cracked lips. There is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger. Once spoken, the words could never be unsaid. To recant later was apostasy punishable by death. The ceremony, dressed in compassion, was a contract of irreversible surrender. Afterward, the women were given new names, often chosen from a list kept by the imam. The names carried beauty, Ikir, Layla, Fatma, but their purpose was erasure. The moment they were written in the registers, the women's old identities ceased to exist, not only socially but legally. Their baptismal or birth names were struck from records, their previous religions nullified. The empire had not only taken their bodies, it had claimed their afterlives. For the Ottoman administration, conversion solved practical problems. A Muslim could not be enslaved by another Muslim, and so conversion transformed captives into permanent dependents of the state rather than tradable property. They belonged now not to the marketplace, but to faith, a subtler prison, but one from which there was no appeal. Occasionally a woman would whisper the truth to a sympathetic servant, or another convert, that she still prayed in her heart to the God of her childhood, that the words forced upon her tongue had not yet reached her soul. Such confessions were dangerous. Apostasy was treason, and treason meant annihilation. Many learned to carry two faiths, one public, one secret. To survive meant to perfect the art of duality, to smile through prayers that wounded them. The empire did not see this as cruelty. Its scholars debated conversion in theological treatises, declaring it a mercy offered to the conquered. They cited scripture arguing that to bring an infidel into the fold of Islam was to elevate her from darkness to light. They called it spiritual rescue. The rescued often called it silence. The ritual itself had its pageantry. After pronouncing the creed, each woman received a small coin, a symbolic gift from the sultan, payment for her entry into the faith. Some kissed it, others dropped it in the dust. A prayer followed, then a feast of sweetened milk and dates. To the observers it was celebration. To the women it was theatre, a coronation of captivity performed in the language of salvation. The consequences extended far beyond ceremony. Under Ottoman law, a convert could not legally return to her previous faith or community. If she escaped and attempted to reunite with her family, she could be hunted down and executed as a blasphemer. Her transformation was permanent. Her past had become a crime. In this way, conversion did what chains could not. It made captivity self-sustaining. No army was needed to guard the soul that now feared its own damnation. The empire had found a way to colonize eternity. This manipulation of faith was not unique to the Ottomans. In 15th century Spain, after the Reconquista, Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity or face exile and death. They too were renamed, baptized and recorded in neat ledgers that erased centuries of lineage. The conversos of Spain and the neophytes of the Ottoman court shared the same paradox. To live, they had to betray themselves. Faith, once a refuge, became an instrument of empire. Other powers learned the same art. In the Americas, conquistadors baptized entire villages at sword point, calling it salvation through water. In Russia, Mongol captives were christened by force under the new Tsars. Everywhere power expanded, God's name was bent into the shape of a whip. For the Ottoman captives, conversion was both ending and beginning. It ended their visible suffering. No more chains, no more markets, but it began a deeper captivity, the erasure of memory, the splittings of soul. The clerics called it peace. Psychologists today would call it disassociation, the mind retreating to survive the unthinkable. In rare moments, witnesses recorded resistance. One chronicler mentions a woman from Albania who, after being forced to recite the Shahada, refused to bow. "My body is yours," she said, "but my faith is not." She was beaten until she could no longer speak. Her silence was written as consent in the imperial report. To the state, the ceremony was proof of divine order restored. To the victim, it was the final theft, the taking of the one thing no sword could reach. Faith had once been their shelter, their bridge to the world they'd lost. Now, it was the tool of their conquerors. The women emerged from the ritual purified in appearance, renamed, perfumed and catalogued, yet something behind their eyes had dimmed. Because conversion in this empire was not liberation, it was the second captivity, a binding not of hands but of eternity. The markets had taken their bodies, the clerics had taken their souls, and between the two nothing of the self remained. When captivity ended for the few who survived, yet freedom did not arrive as salvation. It came like a stranger at the door asking for a name the freed no longer recognized. The chains were gone, the market silent, the gates open, yet inside the captives remained bound to something invisible. For them, release was only another form of exile. Missionary reports from the 17th century preserve faint echoes of these lives after bondage. In one Jesuit letter from Ragusa, a priest recounts the arrival of 3 Christian women lately ransomed from Constantinople. They were placed in a convent for care. but the sisters soon realized that the women no longer spoke any single language fluently. Their words were a mixture of Turkish Greek and fragments of their native Slavic. When they pray, the priest wrote, they move their lips, yet no tongue seems to answer. It is as though the memory of words has been scorched away. Another report from a Franciscan in Bosnia describes a man who had spent 20 years as a household servant in Edirne. Returned by a benevolent master in old age, he found his village abandoned and his faith hollow. He crosses himself to please us, the friar noted, but when he sleeps he whispers the Muslim creed. He has 2 souls and none. Such testimonies reveal what modern psychology calls post-traumatic identity fracture. To endure enslavement, the human mind learns to divide one part, adapting to survive the other, burying pain too deep to touch. When freedom comes, those parts no longer know each other. The survivors of Ottoman captivity live suspended between worlds, too changed for their homelands, too foreign for the empire they left behind. Some tried to rebuild. A few women entered convents or remarried under new names, concealing their pasts as if shame could make them vanish. Others became beggars, wandering from port to port, their stories treated as superstition. There were even those who returned willingly to the empire, unable to live outside the structure that had once imprisoned them. A Venetian merchant described one such woman in 1663. She was redeemed at great cost, yet within the year she sailed back to Constantinople. There, she said, I remember who I am. This paradox, the captive who misses captivity, haunted observers for centuries. But trauma scholars today recognize it as the logic of survival. When suffering becomes the framework of existence, its absence feels like chaos. The women and men who had lived under surveillance, ritual and routine could not easily adjust to unstructured freedom. Their minds had been trained to expect command. Silence frightened them more than cruelty ever had. Language loss compounded the fracture. Linguists studying Balkan oral traditions have noted entire dialects that vanished during the centuries of Ottoman expansion. Songs once sung in villages disappeared because their singers had been taken, and those who returned no longer knew the melodies. Identity, when deprived of language, becomes an echo. In some places, cultural amnesia hardened into myth. Families whispered that their ancestors had gone to serve the Sultan, never saying what that service meant. Others invented noble fictions that their daughters had become queens, their sons courtiers, because to imagine anything less was unbearable. Thus trauma survived not through memory but through distortion. The pain was retold as glory so that the wound could be endured. The parallels to modern displacement are haunting. Refugees who flee war today often describe the same numbness, the inability to recall words only in their mother tongue, the confusion of faith, the sense that home itself has become foreign. Psychologists call it identity dissolution, a form of post-traumatic stress where survival demands forgetting. The Ottoman survivors lived this long before it had a name. A 17th century Italian missionary noted that many freed captives refused to speak about their experiences. When we ask, they lower their eyes and whisper, Allah blir, God knows. It is the only phrase they do not forget. Perhaps it was not forgetfulness, but protection, a language of signals born from centuries of being spoken for. And yet traces of their endurance remain. In certain Balkan lullabies, researchers have found Turkish phrases woven into Slavic melodies, remnants of women who once rocked their children in foreign households. In the embroidery patterns passed through generations, motifs of Ottoman crescents appear beside Christian crosses, unconscious symbols of dual inheritance, fragments of 2 worlds stitched into one cloth. History rarely follows such threads. It counts the conquests, not the survivors. But every faded document, every hybrid song, every borrowed word whispers the same truth: empire may erase names, but it cannot erase consequence. The trauma of captivity did not end with those who lived it. It seeped into families, into language, into the collective nervous system of entire regions. The psychologist Judith Herman once wrote that trauma demands a witness. For the Ottoman captives, that witness was history itself, slow, distant, and often indifferent. Their suffering became sediment layering over centuries until even scholars forgot the original pain that shaped the landscape of the Balkans. Villages depopulated by enslavement never recovered. Languages fractured. Faiths blended into uneasy coexistence. The empire vanished, but its psychological architecture remained: the learned silenced the reflex to bow, the fear of belonging too visibly to oneself. Freedom, when it finally came, felt less like dawn than like blindness. The survivors carried their broken identities into the next century, into children who would inherit their unease. Some sang, some prayed, some simply endured. each of them a quiet monument to the truth that conquest never ends when the war does. Because when the body heals, the memory continues, and memory once fractured never entirely forgets which side of the chain it was on. Empires build monuments to obedience, but resistance leaves quieter traces: a torn letter, a whispered hymn, a footprint in the wrong direction. The Ottoman system, vast and intricate, seemed to leave no room for rebellion. And yet even in its deepest corridors the flame of defiance survived, flickering where no law could reach. Official chronicles seldom mention it. Bureaucracies hate what they cannot categorize. But in the margins of reports, in letters smuggled across borders, and in the oral stories passed down through generations, fragments remain of women who refused, of slaves who fled, of lives that ended by choice rather than decree. One of the earliest accounts comes from the fortress city of Buda, shortly after its fall in 1541. A Venetian spy reported that a group of captured noblewomen destined for the harem threw themselves into the Danube rather than submit. He described the scene in a single line. They leapt as one into the river, their veils floating behind them like white wings. The Ottomans recovered their bodies downstream and buried them in unmarked graves. No prayer was said, yet their silence became its own kind of sermon, a refusal to be translated into the empire's language of survival. Elsewhere, defiance took subtler forms. Some women feigned illness to avoid the harem's selection process, disfiguring themselves with ash or burns to appear undesirable. Others hid fragments of scripture or small crosses in their garments. One woman, a Greek servant, recorded in the archives of Bursa, was discovered to have sewn dozens of tiny messages into the hems of the sultan's linens. They contained no pleas for rescue, only the names of other captives preserved, so they would not be forgotten. When discovered, she was executed, but her act transformed anonymity into remembrance. And then there were the escapes, rare, almost miraculous. Among the thousands taken across the Balkans and Anatolia, only a handful ever found their way home. One such story, drawn from an Austrian monk's testimony, tells of a woman named Magdalena, likely captured near the Drava River in 1530. She had served 8 years in a merchant's household in Bursa, before escaping with the help of a janissary who pitied her. They fled by night, crossing fields and forests guided by the stars. When soldiers pursued them, Magdalena smeared mud on her face and pretended to be mute, hiding in a caravan of shepherds. She finally reached Ragusa disguised as a widow, her Turkish driyas still clinging to her shoulders like another skin. The monk who recorded her story wrote she prayed in 2 tongues, one for God, one for the silence that had saved her. Even inside Topkapi itself, where surveillance was absolute, rebellion found ways to breathe. There were rumours of women who sang forbidden songs late at night, lullabies from their homelands that blended grief with defiance. The eunuchs who overheard sometimes pretended not to notice. Some said that on certain nights when the moon shone across the courtyards, one could hear dozens of these voices rising together, not loud but enough to turn the air into memory. Resistance also moved through the pen. Captives who could write found secret methods to send letters beyond the palace walls. A few were intercepted. One addressed to my sister in Venice, written in shaky Italian, survived in the Ottoman archives. It reads simply, "I am alive. Do not let them say we forgot who we are." It is perhaps the smallest rebellion imaginable, and therefore the most human. But not all defiance was born of hope. Some chose a darker freedom. A 1587 report from the Pera district describes 4 women who poisoned themselves with crushed oleander after being sold to a distant governor. They died in the bathhouse before dawn, their bodies discovered by attendant. The court physician recorded their deaths as a contagion of sorrow. The phrase lingers always, as if grief itself could spread like disease. Modern historians often overlook these small revolts lost amid the grandeur of empire. Yet they reveal a truth that statistics cannot capture, that even within total control, something in the Thagul and the human spirit remains uncolonized. Call it memory. Call it dignity. Call it the refusal to be turned entirely into property. Psychologists studying survivors of enslavement today use a term micro-resistance, small deliberate acts that reclaim agency in impossible circumstances. For the women of the Ottoman world, resistance was not revolution. It was the choice to whisper one's name when no one was listening. It was teaching a child an outlawed prayer. It was the courage to die on one's own terms. And in the centuries that followed, those whispers multiplied. They travelled in songs sung by Balkan mothers, in folk tales of daughters taken by the men of the Crescent in legends, where women leapt into rivers rather than live in gilt cages. The empire tried to erase them, but their absence became presence, a silence that echoed louder than any decree. To study that silence is to hear what history forgot to record, that even when obedience is perfected, resistance survives not as battle but as breath. Empires may teach submission, but they can never fully teach forgetting. Somewhere beneath the marble and gold of Topkapi, beneath the ledgers and laws, the air itself remembers the women who sang their names back into the dark. Because power can command the body but not the soul's refusal to disappear. And sometimes the smallest whisper is the loudest rebellion of all. An empire's true legacy is not the shape of its borders but the habits it leaves behind. The Ottoman system of captivity legalized, taxed, and written in immaculate script outlived canons and sultans because it taught generations how to think about other human beings as units that could be acquired, moved, renamed, and optimized. When the palaces dimmed and the armies thinned, that habit remained like a watermark in the paper of history. The first legacy was demographic. Across the Balkans and borderlands, the empire harvested women of childbearing age and boys in their strongest years. Villages that once rang with wedding songs and ploughmen's shouts learned the sound of absence. Parish registers show lines that break and do not resume. Surnames vanish like tributaries to be swallowed by a larger river. A single campaign could drain hundreds of households. A century of campaigns produced a hollowing that reshaped family structures themselves. Men who returned from war found not only fields unplanted but futures unmade. Communities compensated by marrying earlier or consolidating kinship within shrunken circles patterns that persisted long after the banners changed. This demographic wound bled into culture. Languages frayed where singers were taken and songs went with them. Dialects bent around the edges of loss, borrowing words from Turkish trade and Islamic law because the old words no longer had objects to cling to. In embroidery and cradle songs, in the choreography of hospitality, a palimpsest formed Slavic, Greek, Albanian, Vlach, each rewritten by the same hand, each bearing the faint imprint of the others. The Balkans learned to wear hybridity like a scar and a garment at once. The second legacy was legal. Ottoman jurists did not merely tolerate enslavement, they supplied it with a vocabulary that turned practice into principle. Concepts like ganima, war booty, penchik, the ruler's fifth alwad, the enslaved mother of a master's child, and conversion procedures sutured the trade to religion and statecraft. Those categories migrated through commentary, court precedent, and imitation across the Muslim world. In North Africa and the Red Sea corridor, scholars and magistrates borrowed the same terms to adjudicate human commerce. In the Levant and Arabia, petitions cite analogous rules to justify seizure, resale, or manumission. Even where practice varied, the Ottoman archive supplied an aura of authority. If Istanbul had written it, lesser courts could copy it. Beyond the empire's frontiers, parallel systems hummed. The Crimean slave trade, fed by Tatar raids into the steppe, funneled captives to the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Azov, then onward to Ottoman markets. There the arithmetic matched Constantinople's Slavic and Circassian bodies sorted by age, and sex contracts witnessed taxes skimmed. The trans-Saharan routes braided West and Central Africa to the Mediterranean and Red Sea caravans moving through Takaza, Ghadames and Timbuktu, depositing human beings in Tunis, Tripoli, Cairo, Jeddah. Ottoman garrisons and governors did not invent those roads, but their fiscal machinery interfaced with them, customs posts, notaries and judges transforming what passed through into state-sanctioned profit. These trades were not identical. Each carried local ecologies of power, race and religion. In the Black Sea, Christian captives formed the prime currency. In the Sahara, African captives bore the heaviest burden. In Anatolia and the Balkans, the conquered were the nearest reservoir. But everywhere the same grammar recurred: seizure, legitimized by decree resale, normalized by paperwork ownership, softened by a rhetoric of care and salvation. The variety of victims changed, the logic did not. The third legacy was administrative style. The idea that atrocity can be made efficient, that horror can be gentle on the page. Ottoman chancelleries became schools in which later regimes, some Muslim, some Christian, some secular, learned how to dress domination in clerical calm. You can see the resemblance wherever people are reduced to rows and columns. Ledgers of souls in plantation inventories, convoy lists of deported minorities, rosters of undesirables compiled by prefects and commissars. Each carries the Ottoman lesson: forward distance the act through documentation and the conscience will quiet. This is not to claim that later systems simply copied the Sublime Porte. Oppression needs no single architect. But the Ottomans demonstrated a particularly persuasive method: make the scribe the final arbiter, not the sword. Once the quill becomes the empire's primary weapon, anything can be made to look necessary. The cold beauty of Divani script is not just an aesthetic, it is a theology of administration, an argument that what is elegant must be right. There was also a fiscal genius to the system that subsequent powers admired. Taxation at every node, capture, resale, transport, manumission, converted cruelty into annuity. Governors learned to forecast revenue not merely from crops and caravans, but from bodies in motion. The ledger's promise that next year's line will carry this year's pain forward with interest proved irresistible to states balancing ambition against insolvency. The empire thus exported not only people but methods, a template for how to make oppression pay for itself. And then there is the psychological legacy, the conditioning of subjects to accept paperwork as fate. When generations have watched names disappear into seals and signatures, when petitions are the only available prayers, a culture of supplication takes root. Trust migrates from neighbour to notary, from conscience to rubric. Even long after abolition, the reflex survives. Stand in line lower. Your voice present the paper that proves you exist. The ghost of the register lingers in the collective posture. Comparisons sharpen the outline. In the Crimean steppe, raids were seasonal storms. In the Ottoman core, captivity became climate. The trans-Saharan routes relied on vast geographies and the tyranny of distance. The Ottoman machine added the tyranny of proximity, extracting from the very populations that built its cities and tilled its fields. Where other trades tolerated ambiguity, Istanbul sought uniformity: who counts as slave, how long under what seal, at which tax. This insistence on codification is the lineage that later bureaucratic nightmares would inherit, the idea that if the category is crisp, the conscience may be cloudy. Yet legacies are rarely single colours. Ottoman law also contained paths to manumission, pious endowments, vakuf sometimes sheltered the vulnerable, and individual actors defied the logic around them. There are registers of freedwomen who negotiated wages, of former concubines, who endowed schools of children born in bondage, who rose to the ranks of viziers. These too are part of the bequest, the knowledge that a system can be both crushing and porous, that humanity leaks through even within well-mortared walls. Still, the larger shape remains a civilization that showed the world how to fuse law with subjugation until they became indistinguishable to the people who administered them. Centuries later, when other empires needed to normalize deportations, labor camps or relocations, they reached instinctively for similar tools, registries that rename courts, that reclassify accountants, who alchemize harm into revenue. If you listen carefully, you can hear the old scratch of the reed pen beneath the clatter of typewriters and the hum of servers. The medium modernizes, the habit persists. What then is the legacy of this system? It is the long demographic winter that followed the harvest of the young. It is the cultural braid tied under duress that later generations mistake for natural weave. It is the jurisprudence that dignified ownership and the clerical quiet that made it endurable. It is the spreadsheet of suffering that taught the world to file pain until it looked like policy. And it is the warning written in the margins of those ledgers in a hand we can barely see whenever law stops asking whether a person is a person and starts asking only which box to place them in the empire. Any empire has already begun again. History, when told by victors, prefers symmetry. It likes palaces gleaming under sunlight, the measured cadence of reform, the poetry of law. It writes in marble and calls that eternity. What it hides is the echo beneath the stone, the whisper that beauty was built on pain. The Ottoman story, like so many others, has been polished smooth by time. Its cruelty is footnoted, its victims dissolved into numbers, its monuments left to shimmer untouched by the shadows that funded them. For centuries, scholars praised the empire's sophistication, its architecture, its tolerance, its bureaucracy. And it is true, the Ottomans created magnificence, a civilization that stretched from the Danube to the Nile, from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean. But what is rarely said aloud is that the same precision that made their mosques sublime also made their cruelty efficient. The same pen that wrote poetry also recorded the sale of children. The same marble floors that reflected candlelight once echoed with the sound of chains. Civilization has always worn two faces, one we carve in stone, the other we hide in ink. Every great empire has mastered this duality. Rome with its arenas, Spain with its Inquisition, England with its colonies. The Ottomans were not an exception but a mirror. In their empire, as in all empires, culture and cruelty were twins, sharing the same womb. Beauty made the suffering bearable. Order made it invisible. The question is not how they could do it, but how easily we still understand the logic. We too live amid systems that transform human beings into numbers on spreadsheets in databases behind borders. The form has changed, the language refined, but the arithmetic is familiar. Every age inherits its own machinery of distance ways of writing pain so that it looks like progress. The story of the captives reminds us that forgetting is also a policy. For centuries, chroniclers skipped their names, museums ignored their faces, and textbooks celebrated the empire's grandeur without mentioning the lives that paid for it. Romantic painters filled harems with silken candlelight, never showing the exhaustion behind the gaze. Even now, popular histories call the markets exotic, the palaces opulent, as if adjectives could absolve, but memory is a duty that refuses decorum. To remember these women, the nameless daughters, the vanished wives, the mothers whose children never carried their names, is to disturb the comfort of civilization's self-portrait. It is to say that art and atrocity often share the same room. It is to understand that progress without empathy is merely cruelty in uniform. In the end, what matters is not condemnation but recognition. To study the empire's administration of despair is to see how easily humanity can be rationalized away not by monsters, but by men who believe themselves moral. Every scribe who recorded a sale, every official who sealed a decree, every merchant who calculated a tax, they were not driven by hatred but by habit, and that is the most frightening inheritance of all. The quiet historians remind us that remembrance is not vengeance, it is clarity. To look back is not to accuse the dead but to warn the living. The documents still breathe parchment whispering under glass numbers etched with faith or faith in their precision. Listen closely and they say this was once called normal. The past does not demand guilt, demands guardianship. Each retelling reclaims a fragment of dignity from the silence that once buried it. Each word spoken aloud is an act of defiance against the long habit of forgetting. Because history left untended repeats not through malice but through comfort. The same comfort that made empires efficient, that taught scribes to believe that ink absolved blood. To remember is to break that comfort, to hear the whisper under the marble and recognize it as a warning. The markets are gone, the ledgers sealed, the palaces turned into museums. Yet their architecture remains inside us, the instinct to look away from suffering when it is neatly arranged, when it comes with receipts and justifications. The Ottoman Empire is history, but its pattern is modern. So we end not with accusation but invitation. To remember even when it is inconvenient. To speak even when silence is polite. To see beauty and still ask what it cost. Because forgetting is how cruelty learns to breathe again. And memory, fragile, uncomfortable, human, is the only thing that ever stops it. Lessons from the Empire of Silence. What history still teaches us. When we study the Ottoman system of captivity, its ledgers, its rituals, its polished cruelty, we are not just reading about the past, we are holding up a mirror. Behind the gilded walls of empire lie questions that have never stopped haunting humanity. How easily do we normalize suffering when it is systematized? How quickly does paperwork turn violence into order? And how often do we mistake progress for morality simply because it runs on time and writes in beautiful script? The first lesson is about distance. The Ottomans proved that cruelty need not be loud. It can wear gloves, use ink, and quote scripture. In our own age, the mechanisms of distance are different, but no less effective. Bureaucracies can still turn human pain into numbers, whether in refugee statistics, factory quotas, or social media metrics. When we measure lives instead of feeling them, we repeat the empire's quietest sin. True civilization begins where empathy refuses to be abstract. The second lesson concerns language. Empires survive by controlling words, by renaming captives, reframing cruelty, and redefining justice. Today we do the same, only with new vocabularies, collateral damage, detention centers, economic necessity. The labels change, but the instinct to rename pain so it sounds acceptable endures. To live consciously is to resist euphemism, to insist on calling things by their rightful names, even when those names make us uncomfortable. The third lesson is about memory and complicity. The Ottoman scribes did not believe themselves evil. They believed themselves dutiful. They obeyed procedure, honoured hierarchy, and met their deadlines. Evil often comes dressed as efficiency. The antidote is awareness, the courage to look at a system we benefit from and ask who pays the invisible price. Silence, even polite silence, is a form of participation. Remembering is a moral act because it keeps conscience awake. The fourth lesson is the endurance of the human spirit. For every act of domination there were whispers of resistance, women who sang forbidden songs, captives who preserved names, mothers who chose death over surrender. Their defiance reminds us that dignity cannot be legislated out of existence. No matter how absolute the structure of control, there remains a corner of the soul that refuses command. When we face hardship today, personal or collective, their memory is proof that the will to resist, to remain human in inhuman conditions, is one of history's most sacred inheritances. Finally, there is the lesson of moral vigilance. The Ottoman story teaches that civilization and barbarism are not opposites, but neighbours sharing the same street. The danger is not cruelty itself, but the comfort that allows it to settle quietly into routine. The more sophisticated a society becomes, the easier it is to hide its injustices behind procedure, rhetoric, or aesthetics. Progress must be measured not by beauty or wealth, but by how gently it holds the powerless. To remember these lessons is not to judge the past, but to protect the present. Each generation must decide whether it will polish history's monuments or listen to their echoes. Every time we speak for the silenced, every time we refuse the luxury of indifference, we break the cycle that empires taught us to repeat. Memory, then, is not a burden, it is a form of resistance. And resistance in any age begins with the simplest act of all, refusing to look away. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.